Imagine a hot summer day, somewhere across the endless expanse of the Eastern Front. Dust rises like a pillar above the road. The air trembles from the heat and the roar of engines. Along this road moves a column of German armored vehicles, steel predators, confident in their strength and invincibility. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks loaded with infantry and ammunition. A whole river of gray steel flowing toward the front line. Now imagine a different picture. In a roadside grove, camouflaged with branches, a small, angular armored car lies in ambush. So tiny that next to a German tank it looks like a toy. Inside this cramped steel box sit only two men, two soldiers whose orders were clear: conduct reconnaissance and under no circumstances engage superior enemy forces. Any reasonable man in their place, seeing such an armada, would have immediately withdrawn, reported the situation, and considered his duty done. But what if I told you that this little armored car did not retreat, that its crew made a decision that defied every order, every bit of logic and common sense? They chose to fight. Two men against an entire column. Sounds like suicide, doesn't it? And yet, this seemingly insane act became one of the most incredible and, perhaps most astonishingly, almost forgotten feats of the entire war. This isn't a story about generals or marshals, nor about grand battles that decided the fate of nations. It's a story about two unknown heroes in their small combat vehicle, the BA-64, who, in one brief fight, did the impossible. Most importantly, it's a story that has almost vanished from official records. Why? How did they do it? And who were these men? Let's try to untangle this mystery together. One that has hidden for decades the secret of a truly extraordinary act of courage. To grasp the full depth and uniqueness of this event, we must travel back to the very heart of the war, the summer of 1943. It was a time of immense tension and effort. The Battle of Stalingrad had just ended, showing the world that the German war machine was not invincible. But there was no room for relaxation. The Wehrmacht remained powerful, experienced, and thirsting for revenge. A gigantic clash was approaching on the Kursk Bulge, a battle that would decide, once and for all, who would hold the strategic initiative. In those days, every cog in the vast machinery of the army mattered. Every tank, every plane, every soldier, and of course, every scout. In a war like this, information was worth more than gold. Knowing where the enemy concentrated his forces, where he planned to strike, and which routes he used to move reinforcements, that was what determined the success or failure of entire operations. It was for such missions that light, mobile reconnaissance units were created. Their primary purpose was not to fight, but to observe, listen, and report. They were the eyes and ears of the army. Their weapons were speed and stealth. Engaging in open combat, especially against armor, meant certain death and the failure of the mission. And yet, in this heated atmosphere, where every kilometer of the front brimmed with anticipation of the decisive clash, on one seemingly secondary sector, operated our crew. Their armored car, the BA-64, was not a formidable weapon. It was a workhorse of reconnaissance, a nimble eye on wheels. When command sent them out, they expected a report on enemy movements, not a list of destroyed German tanks. No one, absolutely no one, could have imagined that this little machine and its crew would become the cause of a local catastrophe for an entire German unit. This background, the anticipation of a great battle, the priceless value of reconnaissance data, and the strict order not to engage, makes their later decision even more astonishing and desperate. Now, let's take a closer look at the main character of our story, the machine itself, the BA-64 armored car, which soldiers affectionately, though perhaps with a touch of irony, nicknamed Bobik. How did this little machine come to be? Its history is a hymn to wartime ingenuity and the ability to work under the harshest conditions. By the beginning of the war, the Red Army already had armored cars, for example, the BA-20, but those had been designed back in the 1930s and by 1941 were clearly outdated. They lacked cross-country mobility, had weak armor, and broke down frequently. The war demanded something new, simple, cheap to produce, reliable, and, most importantly, capable of moving not only along roads but across rough terrain. The idea was in the air. What if we took the chassis of an existing, well-proven four-wheel drive Army vehicle and gave it armor? That vehicle was the BA-64, the Soviet equivalent of the famous American Willys Jeep. A true workhorse, able to crawl through almost any terrain. And so, the design bureau of the Gorky automobile plant, under the leadership of the brilliant engineer Vitaly Andreevich Grachev, took up the challenge. They worked at a frantic pace. The order came in the fall of 1941, during the darkest days, when the enemy stood at the gates of Moscow. And already by early 1942, the first prototype was ready. Imagine it, the country on the brink of catastrophe, factories being evacuated, a shortage of materials, of manpower. Yet engineers managed to design a completely new combat vehicle in just a few months. The design was as simple as possible, no excess, no decoration. The armored plates of the hull were placed at sharp angles. It was a brilliant decision. It not only increased the chance that enemy bullets and shrapnel would ricochet off, but also made it possible to use thinner, and therefore lighter armor without sacrificing much in protection. The turret, which could rotate 360 degrees, was fitted with a 7.62 mm DT machine gun. Of course, that wasn't a cannon, but for reconnaissance and infantry support missions it was considered enough. And thus Bobik was born, a small, nimble, all-wheel drive armored car, forged in the fire of war and made for the fire of war. It was never meant to fight tanks, but its creators gave it everything they could to give its crew at least a fighting chance to survive and complete their mission. Designing military vehicles is always a matter of compromise, especially in wartime. In creating the BA-64, Grachev's team faced numerous complex problems, each demanding an ingenious solution. The main paradox lay in the concept itself. They needed to build a light and fast vehicle, yet also protect it with armor. But armor means weight, extra weight that strains the engine and suspension, reducing both speed and mobility. How to find the golden balance? They based the design on the chassis of the light off-road BA-64, but it had never been intended to carry tons of steel. The frame had to be reinforced, yet resources were scarce. The engine, with only 50 horsepower, didn't promise much either. Outstanding dynamics, so the engineers focused instead on optimizing the angles of the armor. They literally sat with pencils and rulers, calculating every degree. They knew that a frontal armor plate only 15 millimeters thick could never stop a shell, but it could deflect a rifle bullet or even a heavy machine gun round fired from medium range. The sharply sloped armor plates helped tremendously with that. Another major headache was stability. The vehicle had a fairly narrow wheelbase, inherited from the GAZ off-roader, and a high center of gravity because of the armored hull and the turret. On steep turns or side slopes, there was a real risk of overturning. The first field tests made that painfully clear. Engineers had to quickly modify the design, widening the track, which led to the improved BA-64B model. Even then, however, drivers had to be true masters of control not to flip the car onto its side. And what about inside? Inside it was very cramped. The two-man crew, the driver and the commander, who also served as gunner, sat shoulder to shoulder. Visibility was, to put it mildly, limited. The driver looked forward through a small slit covered by bulletproof glass and a pair of narrow side slots. The commander, standing in the turret, had a better view, but under fire he had to close the hatch and rely solely on periscopic sights. It was a real challenge for the designers. how to fit 2 people, ammunition, and a radio set, which not all vehicles even had, into such a tiny space, while still allowing them to work effectively. Every centimeter of space mattered. Looking at this machine, you realize its creators weren't just engineers. They were artists of minimalism, able to craft a fully functional and, as history would prove, vital military tool out of extremely limited resources. Let's step inside this cramped steel box and imagine what it was like to serve there, to be part of a BA-64 crew. Picture yourself as the driver. Your seat is right up front. The steering will almost press to your chest. To your right, the engine roars, separated from you by only a thin metal partition. In summer, the heat inside was unbearable. The scorching air mixed with the warmth of the engine. In winter, the metal froze through completely. Only a sheepskin coat could save you. Before your eyes is a narrow viewing slit. While on the move, you could keep it open, but in battle it had to be shut with an armored cover, leaving only a tiny triplex glass window, one that quickly got splattered with mud. You drove almost blind, relying on your commander's shouted directions and your own instincts. The pedals were stiff, the gear lever demanded brute strength, and the suspension was unforgiving. Every bump sent the car jolting hard enough to hit your head on the ceiling. Now imagine yourself in the commander's place. You stand on a small adjustable seat. Your workspace is the rotating turret, which had to be turned manually by pushing with your shoulder against a curved handlebar. It took serious effort, especially when the vehicle was moving over rough ground. In front of you is the DT machine gun. To aim accurately, you had to press your eye to the sight. Spent casings spilled under your feet, and gunpowder smoke filled the already suffocating compartment. Besides firing, you were responsible for navigation, battlefield observation, and communication. If your vehicle had a radio, and most didn't, you had to operate it, reporting on the situation. If not, then all responsibility rested on you alone. You were the eyes, ears, and brain of this tiny fortress. The noise inside was deafening. The roar of the engine, the metallic clatter of the track extensions, if fitted for rough terrain, the rattle of your own machine gun, and worst of all, the terrifying hammering of enemy bullets striking the armor. It sounded like blows of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, sharp, ringing, nerve-shredding. Each strike reminded you just how thin that sheet of steel was separating you from death. To live and fight under such conditions was a true test of both body and spirit. The BA-64 crew had to function not merely as a team but as a single organism, where driver and commander understood each other instantly, by half a word, by a gesture. Their survival and the success of the mission depended entirely on that unity and instinctive coordination. The BA-64's main, and indeed only standard weapon, was the DT-29 machine gun, the Degtyaryov tank version. It was a legend in its own right, reliable and sturdy, much like the Kalashnikov that would come later. The DT served throughout the entire war, mounted on most Soviet tanks and armored vehicles. Its most recognizable feature was the flat, circular pan magazine on top, resembling a plate. Commonly known among soldiers as the Degtyar. It used the same 7.62 mm caliber as the Mosin rifle, a huge logistical advantage, since ammunition was plentiful and standardized across the Red Army. The weapon itself was simple and dependable. It could be easily removed from the turret mount and used outside the vehicle. A pair of folding bipods was provided for that purpose. But let's be honest. Against tank armor, this machine gun was completely powerless. Even armor-piercing rounds could at best leave a scratch on the front plate of a German Tiger or Panther. They couldn't even penetrate the side of a light tank. So what was the point? How could the crew of our nameless little armored car possibly stand against an entire German column armed with only this weapon? Here lies the key to their tactics. They never intended to engage in a nightly duel, firing at armor head-on. Their target wasn't the tanks themselves, it was the weak points of any moving military column. A tank has viewing slits, triplex visors. A bullet that hits them won't destroy the vehicle, but it can blind the crew, force the driver to halt, and paralyze the formation. A burst across the optics, and the mighty tank becomes blind and helpless. Another weak point: the tracks. A machine gun bullet can't break a track link, but it can damage or jam a road wheel. Yet even that wasn't the main idea. The most vulnerable parts of any armored column weren't the tanks at all. They were the support vehicles fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, troop transports, and staff cars, all with armor far thinner than that of tanks. Those were the true targets for a weapon like the DT. A single, well-aimed burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into a fuel truck could turn it into a giant fireball, blocking the road, spreading panic, and igniting nearby vehicles. A burst into a truck carrying shells, and the resulting explosion could wipe out everything within dozens of meters. In skilled hands, that machine gun ceased to be just a tool of self-defense. It became a surgical instrument capable of inflicting enormous damage on the enemy without ever directly confronting his main force. And the crew of our little Bobik understood that perfectly. Their plan was daring but not insane. It was built on a clear understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. How did the Germans themselves view these small Soviet armored cars? What place did the BA-64 occupy in their perception of the battlefield? At first, when these vehicles appeared on the front in 1942, German soldiers and officers treated them with open disdain. In reports and after-action documents, the BA-64 was often described simply as a light four-wheeled reconnaissance vehicle. They noted its weak armament and thin armor, and compared to their own eight-wheeled Puma cars armed with cannons, the Soviet Bobik did indeed look unimpressive. Any German 37mm anti-tank gun, not to mention heavier weapons, could punch through it from any range. A tank could crush it outright beneath its treads. So early on, German tactics toward the BA-64 were simple. Ignore it if it wasn't a nuisance, or destroy it with whatever weapon was at hand if it was. They saw it as nothing more than an irritating scout, easy to chase off or eliminate. But over time, as experience grew, that attitude changed. The Germans began to note with surprise the tenacity and audacity of these machines. A BA-64 could appear suddenly where it was least expected, thanks to its excellent mobility. It could dart from a forest, unleash a burst into a column, and vanish before the tanks could even swing their turrets. The Germans began calling it the Brat or the Flea. They realized that the true danger of the vehicle lay not in its armor or gun, but in its crew. Soviet soldiers exploited every advantage, speed, maneuverability, and small size, to the fullest. They set ambushes, struck fast, retreated, and harassed enemy units with hit-and-run tactics, targeting their most vulnerable spots. For the commander of a German tank column on the march, a sudden appearance of a BA-64 could become a real nightmare. No, it couldn't destroy a tank, but it could torch a fuel truck, leaving the entire column stranded within 50 kilometers. It could obliterate a staff car with maps and orders. Could sow panic among infantry packed into trucks. And so, contempt gradually gave way to wary respect. German field manuals began including notes warning troops not to underestimate these small armored cars and to immediately post guards or reconnaissance patrols upon sighting one. The most dangerous enemy, after all, is the one you underestimate. And on that summer day in 1943, the commander of a German column, upon encountering our lone Bobik, likely made exactly that classic mistake. He saw a toy, not a threat, and that error would cost him dearly. Who, then, were the men who sat behind the wheel and the gun of these tiny armored cars? Were they elite soldiers specially trained for such missions? The answer, not really. BA-64 crews were often formed from soldiers of various branches. Many were former cavalrymen or motorcyclists from disbanded units. What united them was experience. They already knew how to scout, how to navigate terrain, and how to value speed and maneuverability. Drivers were usually chosen from those with real combat or technical experience, men who had smelled powder and knew machines. But wartime conditions rarely allowed ideal choices. Crews were often filled by whoever was available, trained on the spot, and rushed into action. Training programs were minimal and brutally condensed. The essentials: how to drive off-road, how to service the vehicle, how to fire the machine gun. No one trained them for long battles or duels with tanks. Their doctrine was simple: -C, report, withdraw. Training for the vehicle commander was a bit more serious. He had to know reconnaissance tactics, be able to read a map, use a compass, identify enemy equipment types, and write competent reports. But again, all this was taught in an accelerated fashion. The real school for these crews was the front. There, in actual combat, they learned the subtleties of their craft. They learned to feel the vehicle, understand its limits, anticipate the enemy's actions, and communicate with one another without words, by gestures and looks alone. This work required a special temperament, courage bordering on audacity, but tempered with cold calculation. You had to know how to take risks without exposing yourself thoughtlessly. You needed iron nerves to keep your head under fire. Many crews died in their first battles. The armor was too thin and the temptation to enter an unnecessary fight too great. The survivors, those who learned to think, to trick, and to exploit their vehicle's strengths, became real masters. They turned into a headache for the enemy, elusive ghosts able to strike and vanish into folds of terrain. The crew in our story undoubtedly belonged to this number of aces. Their decision to attack a column was not an act of desperation, but the result of a cool, precise calculation based on combat experience, knowledge of the enemy, and absolute confidence in themselves and their machine. They were not merely soldiers, they were hunters, and that day they went out on their largest hunt. How were BA-64s actually used at the front? What place did they occupy in battle formations? Their tactical niche was fairly broad, but all tasks in one way or another revolved around their chief qualities: speed and cross-country mobility. Their primary role, of course, was reconnaissance. A BA-64 could go on deep raids into the enemy's rear to locate reserves, headquarters, or depots, small and inconspicuous. It could slip through where larger vehicles could not. Often they operated in pairs or threes, covering each other. A second important task was combat escort. They accompanied columns of their own troops, protecting them from sudden enemy raids or air attacks. The DT machine gun mounted in the turret could also fire at aircraft, making the Bobik a decent short-range AA asset for marching columns. A third function was communications. In rapidly changing situations, especially during offensives, the BA-64 was indispensable for carrying orders and reports between units. Where telephone lines were cut and radio unreliable, a nimble armored car could quickly deliver a dispatch to the right headquarters. In addition, they were often used as staff cars for regimental and divisional commanders, a fast means to move along the front, personally assess the situation, and direct combat. But over time, as experience accumulated, crews began to adopt more aggressive tactics that went beyond standard instructions. These were the strike raids we mentioned earlier. A group of several BA-64s could suddenly swoop on an enemy HQ, an airfield, or a depot. They would burst into the target area, pour lead from their machine guns, throw grenades, sow panic and destruction, then disappear just as fast. The effect of such raids was often more psychological than material. The Germans stopped feeling safe, even in the deep rear. That constant fear of sudden attack exhausted them, kept them tense, and forced the diversion of large forces to guard rear communications. Of course, such operations carried enormous risk. Many vehicles did not return from raids, but those that did brought invaluable intelligence and inflicted tangible damage on the enemy. Gradually, the BA-64 evolved from a simple scout into a versatile battlefield vehicle, a true jack-of-all-trades. Our nameless crew, who dared attack a tank column, acted in line with this tactical evolution. From passive observation toward active, audacious, and unexpected action. The evolution of BA-64 tactics is a fascinating story of adaptation and inventiveness born from the harsh realities of the battlefield. Initially, doctrine was rigid and conservative, reflecting pre-war notions about armored cars' roles, reconnaissance, communication, and column escort. Leadership's directive was unambiguous. Observe, report, and avoid direct clashes with superior enemy forces, especially with armored units. Speed was the main weapon, concealment the chief defense. The first encounters in 1942 proved costly lessons in how not to act. Crews who tried to attack German transports head-on or who lingered in open terrain were quickly destroyed by superior enemy fire. The BA-64's thin armor protected only against bullets and fragments and was utterly useless against anything heavier. Heavy losses among armored car units forced a tactical rethink. It was the surviving crews who began to write the new tactical handbook. Bitter experience taught them that their little vehicle had unique advantages not fully appreciated by command. Its low silhouette made it a hard target, and its excellent off-road capability, inherited from the BA-64 chassis, allowed them to appear in unexpected places, crossing terrain impassable for heavier German vehicles. From these realizations, a new tactic was born: hit and withdraw. The BA-64 would take up a concealed position overlooking a road, wait for a German column, and deliver a short, precise burst from its DT machine gun. Not at the tanks, but at the soft targets: fuel trucks, staff cars, and infantry riding in open trucks. By the time the enemy reacted, the armored car was already backing into cover and racing toward a pre-chosen fallback position to strike again. This created the illusion of a large attacking force, sowed confusion, and forced the enemy to halt, losing precious time. Another effective method was the diversionary maneuver. While the main Soviet forces prepared an ambush or an assault, one or two BA-64s would suddenly appear on the enemy's flank, firing and moving constantly to draw attention. When German tank turrets turned to engage this noisy distraction, they exposed their sides and rears to Soviet anti-tank guns. These crews became masters of using terrain. They knew how to take advantage of every fold, every grove, every half-ruined building as cover. They didn't think like tankers, they thought like mounted scouts or partisans on wheels. That shift in mindset was crucial. They didn't fight a war of attrition, they fought a war of disruption, a psychological war. Their goal was not to destroy every tank, but to paralyze the enemy, disrupt his logistics, and undermine his morale. The story of our lone BA-64 crew attacking a tank column is the ultimate expression of this evolved doctrine. It was not madness. It was a calculated act of tactical genius that exploited every advantage of their machine and every weakness of the enemy's formation. They were not just brave, they were clever, cunning, and utterly in command of their deadly craft. Let's return now to that scorching summer day and try to reconstruct the moments leading up to the battle. Our BA-64 crew, just two men, the commander and the driver-mechanic, receive a routine morning order to conduct reconnaissance in a designated sector, to check the situation along a country road running parallel to the main highway, and to pay particular attention to possible enemy troop movement. The task is clear and ordinary, nothing unusual. They inspect their vehicle, refuel the tanks, and replenish their ammunition. A few DT drum magazines, a couple of grenades, just in case. Their sidearms. The driver checks the oil, listens to the engine's rhythm. The commander studies the map again, plotting the route, marking good observation points and potential retreat paths. There's no haste, only calm, disciplined routine. They are no longer rookies. They've done dozens of such missions. They know that in reconnaissance, haste kills, only vigilance keeps you alive. They set off. The engine sputters, then roars softly as the little armored car rolls out from its position and into the gray zone, the no man's land between armies. Around them, silence reigns, broken only by the chirping of grasshoppers and the steady hum of their motor. The landscape is typical for these regions. Patches of forest, fields of ripening wheat, ravines, small villages, many burned or abandoned. The commander, standing half out of the turret, scans the horizon through his binoculars. The driver keeps the vehicle in the shadows of the trees, using every fold in the ground to stay hidden. An hour passes, then another. They're already far from their own lines. The area seems quiet, no sign of the enemy. It could almost feel like an easy patrol, but experience tells them better. The greatest danger hides in deceptive calm. They reach a small hill, which, according to the map, should offer a clear view of the very road they're meant to observe. The engine is cut. Silence now becomes the priority. The driver stays inside, ready to start the motor at a second's notice. The commander, taking his binoculars, crawls forward carefully to the crest of the hill. Lying flat in the grass, he raises the lenses to his eyes and slowly sweeps them along the road. And at that very moment his heart freezes. What he sees through the binoculars exceeds his worst expectations. It's not a stray supply truck or a pair of motorcyclists. It's an entire steel river, rolling down the road, raising clouds of dust. Tanks, many tanks. The moment of truth. The commander lies flat on the hilltop, and through the lenses unfolds a scene that would chill any scout to the bone. It isn't just a few vehicles, it's a full combat group. Leading the column are Panzer IVs, their long barrels glinting in the sun. Behind them, Hanomag half-tracks packed with infantry. Between them rumble Opel trucks, almost certainly loaded with ammunition and fuel. The column stretches for several kilometers, moving steadily and confidently, like masters of the field. Security, it seems, is light. The Germans clearly aren't expecting trouble here. The commander's first reaction, the correct one, is shock. The second, get out now. The mission is done. He's gathered critical intelligence. The enemy is redeploying a major armored force. That's information of strategic value. He slides down from the crest, rushes back to his armored car. Start it, he orders the driver quietly. The engine begins to rumble, but as it does, the commander's thoughts race furiously. He replays the scene in his mind. The long, stretched-out column, the trucks between the tanks, the road running across open ground with a forest hugging one side. Perfect cover. And then the idea strikes him. A mad dash, audacious idea. What if they didn't just leave? What if they tried to stop them, or at least delay them? Delay them for an hour, maybe two. With the Battle of Kursk imminent, every hour mattered. Those tanks weren't heading out for a joyride, they were going to kill his comrades. If they could delay them here, they might not make it to the battlefield in time. Yes, it would mean disobeying direct orders they were told not to engage. Yes, it was almost certain death. The odds of survival against such a force were near zero. But the chance to deal the enemy a crippling blow through surprise, that was unique. He looks at his driver. The man waits silently, eyes fixed, awaiting orders. They've fought together for months. They understand each other without words. Listen, the commander says, his voice calm, steady, no hesitation at all. I've got an idea. Look, the column's stretched out. If we hit here dash in the middle where the supply trucks are, it'll cause a jam. The tanks in front won't be able to turn around, and the ones in the rear won't understand what's happening right away. We can turn their strength against them and make them choke on it. The driver looks at him for a moment, then nods once. Just once. That nod says everything. Total trust, readiness to go to the end. The decision is made. They won't retreat. They're going to fight. Their own decision. Their own responsibility. Their own war which is about to begin. The plan is bold yet simple as all genius plans are. Don't attack head-on. Don't try to match armor with armor or firepower with firepower. Instead, use the Germans' greatest advantage, their numbers, and turn it into their weakness. The commander quickly outlines the plan. See that bend? He points. After it comes a straight stretch. That's where 2 fuel trucks and some ammo carriers are moving in the middle. Those are our targets. We'll burst out of that treeline at full speed, run parallel to the column, and hit only those vehicles. All we need is to ignite one, just one, and the road will be blocked. Panic will spread. Then we vanish back into the forest from a different direction. The driver grips the wheel tight. He knows his machine inside and out. He knows what it can do. The BA-64 creeps forward under cover of trees toward the chosen attack point. The crew's hearts hammer like pistons. Adrenaline floods their veins. This is no longer reconnaissance, this is a hunt. They're in position now. Through the leaves, the road is visible, the German steel beasts crawling along it. The commander loads the DT, locking in a drum of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Ready? He asks. Ready? Comes the muffled reply. Go! The little armored car roars out of the treeline. For the Germans, it's a total surprise. One of the infantrymen riding atop a half-track spots it and points in disbelief, but it's already too late. The BA-64 races alongside the column, turret turned right. The commander leans into the sight, crosshairs fixed on the first fuel truck. A short, precise burst rattles out. Sparks fly across the tanker side. A miss. The second burst, a hit. Streams of fuel spray out through the holes, igniting instantly from the glowing tracers. An enormous orange fireball erupts skyward. The shockwave knocks infantry off a nearby half-track. The fuel truck driver leaps out, engulfed in flames. But the crew of the Bobik doesn't look back. Their target now is the next truck, the one carrying crates. Another burst. Bullets rip through the canvas cover. A heartbeat later, the second, even greater explosion. The crates of shells detonate, scattering fire and steel in all directions. The road becomes hell itself. Burning debris blocks the way. The column is split in two. The maneuver worked flawlessly. Go! The commander shouts. The driver wrenches the wheel, the armored car kicking up dust as it dives back into the sheltering forest. The first phase of the plan is done, but it's only the beginning. What's happening now in the German column? Chaos, complete, paralyzing chaos. Imagine being a German soldier. A minute ago you were half-dozing atop a half-track, lulled by the heat and the hum of the engine. Then suddenly a roar, 2 massive explosions, the ground trembling, flaming debris everywhere. Ahead, a wall of smoke and fire. Your comrades are screaming. No one knows what's happening. Airstrike? Artillery? Partisans? Panic, that most contagious and deadly of forces, spreads like wildfire. The road is boxed in, forest on one side, open fields on the other. The lead tank commander sees the inferno ahead and halts. The rest stop behind him. The column that moments ago moved as one living organism is now a jumble of machines. Officers shout orders, but their voices are lost in the roar of flames and the popping of exploding ammunition. Meanwhile, the BA-64 has already relocated. After driving a few hundred meters through the forest, it takes up a new ambush position, this time near the tail of the column. The commander watches the confusion unfold. He sees tanks trying to pull off the road, bogging down in the ditch. Infantry dismounting, firing wildly into the trees. They're expecting an attack. But from where? They have no idea. The Bobik's crew strikes again. A short burst at the last half-track. The bullets don't penetrate, but they rattle loudly off the armor, scattering the soldiers behind it in panic. Then the armored car shifts position again, classic shoot-and-scoot tactics. Constant movement makes one gun sound like many. The Germans, unnerved, open fire in all directions. Tank turrets swing toward the woods, hurling one high-explosive shell after another. Trees splinter. The earth shakes with each blast, but they're firing blindly at ghosts. And the little nimble is already in its third position, and from there, it lashes out again with a short, precise burst. This time the target is the staff car that the commander had noticed at the very beginning. He doesn't destroy it, but his fire sends German officers diving for the ground, maps scattering into the dust. The main objective is achieved. The column's command structure is broken. It is no longer a coordinated fighting unit, only a confused, panicked target. The German commander is furious. He cannot understand who is attacking him or how. He cannot organize a counterattack because he cannot see the enemy. His tanks are jammed on the narrow road, blocked by burning wrecks. He has fallen into a perfectly executed trap, one laid for him by only 2 men, in a tiny armored car. This officer, most likely a veteran of several campaigns, now finds himself in an absurd situation. His mighty armored fist has been paralyzed by the sting of an invisible mosquito. He knows he must act, and fast. His first order: send the infantry into the woods. Find and destroy these partisans. Dozens of grenadiers crouch low and enter the forest, weapons at the ready. They move cautiously, expecting ambushes, machine gun nests, mines. But the forest is empty. They find only fresh wool tracks that vanish deeper among the trees. While the infantry comb the woods on one side, the BA-64 has already slipped out on the other. It's as if the little car is toying with them. The driver is a master, weaving between trees, using every dip and bush for cover. The commander, half exposed from the turret, listens intently. He hears snapping branches, German voices. The enemy is close, but he doesn't attack. He's waiting. The German troops, finding nothing, begin to return to the column. And just as they step out of the tree line, thinking the danger has passed, rat-a-tat! A burst from the DT machine gun cracks from around a bend in the road. Bullets whip overhead, driving the grenadiers flat into the dust. This is no longer just a firefight, it's psychological warfare. The BA-64 crew's goal isn't to kill them all, but to exhaust them, to terrify them, to make them believe they're surrounded, that a whole battalion of Soviet troops is in the forest. The tank crews, locked inside their baking steel coffins, grow increasingly nervous. They can't help their infantry. Their powerful cannons are useless against an enemy that appears for a second and vanishes again. They can only swing their turrets helplessly and fire shells into empty trees. Half an hour passes, then an hour. The column stands still. Smoke from the burning vehicles still rises into the sky. The Germans make several attempts to clear the road, but each one is met by a precise burst from a new, unexpected position. Their casualties are probably not high. A few burned-out vehicles, a handful of wounded. But the real loss is time, precious time, slipping away on that cursed road, and morale. Their confidence, their sense of superiority, has evaporated, replaced by confusion, anger, and fear of an unseen enemy. The cat-and-mouse game continues. The BA-64 is like a ghost, a shadow gliding along the forest's edge, giving the Germans no rest. Whenever they try to use a tank to push the wreckage aside, Another burst rattles from a distant hill, harmlessly striking armor but freezing the driver in place. Work stops again. When a group of engineers tries to check the roadside for mines, the Germans now suspect the area might be mined. They're immediately raked by flanking fire. The German commander realizes infantry alone can't solve this problem. He takes a desperate step, orders 2 Panzer IVs to leave the road and swing around through the open field to encircle the elusive foe. The tanks growl, slide off the embankment, and lumber across the uneven ground. This is exactly what the BA-64 commander has been waiting for. On open ground, a tank is terrifying. But here, among ridges and hollows, its speed drops, its vulnerability grows. The BA-64 has no intention of dueling with them. The commander has another plan. The driver pulls the car to the forest's edge, just enough for both tanks to see it. A brief pause. Then the commander fires a short, taunting burst toward one of them and shouts, "Back! Behind the hill!" The maneuver is flawless. The German tankers see their insolent little attacker. Rage blinds them. They forget caution. Both tanks turn their turrets toward the hill where the armored car vanished and accelerate, eager to crush the flea. They don't notice that by doing so, they're exposing their flanks. But no shot comes. The BA-64 commander doesn't attack. It's another deception. He has simply drawn their attention, made them focus on one phantom point. Meanwhile, nothing happens. But now those tanks are far from the column. They've been lured away, chasing ghosts, leaving the main force without cover. The small armored car has already changed position again. From a safe distance, the crew watches in satisfaction as the 2 German beasts trundle aimlessly across the field, searching for an enemy that no longer exists. Time keeps slipping away. The sun begins to sink. What began as a brief skirmish has turned into an hours-long, exhausting duel of nerves and cunning. And then comes the turning point. Whether by sheer luck, the kind that favors the bold, or by a stroke of the BA-64 commander's tactical genius, fate delivers its final twist. While the 2 German tanks hunt phantoms in the field, the Bobik crew makes a daring move. Instead of retreating deeper into the forest, they skirt along its edge, circling back toward the head of the column, the very spot where it all began. The Germans left on the road are certain the enemy is still hidden somewhere opposite their center line in the woods. They never expect an attack from the front. The BA-64 bursts onto the road right in front of the lead tank, the one still idling behind the burned-out fuel truck. The distance is point blank. The tankers have no time to react. The BA-64 commander doesn't aim for the armor. He fires a long burst directly into the track and the driver's vision slit, then hurls one of his grenades under the tank's belly. The explosion can't destroy the tank, but the shock, smoke, and noise do the job. The crew inside, blinded and deafened, assumes they've been hit by an anti-tank gun. They bail out in panic. That sight ignites a chain reaction. If the lead tank is down, the situation must be catastrophic. And then fate intervenes again. One of the DT's ricocheting rounds strikes an open crate of signal flares on the next half-track. The flares ignite, shooting off in all directions, lighting the scene with red, green, and white bursts. To the German troops, who can't see the whole battlefield, it looks like a signal for retreat or worse, a sign that they're surrounded and being finished off. Panic erupts. Truck drivers, terrified, try to turn around on the narrow road, creating an even worse jam. Infantrymen, seeing tank crews abandon their vehicles, begin retreating toward the woods in search of cover. The column, once a single powerful formation, disintegrates into chaos. Battle order collapses completely, and all of it, the confusion, the paralysis, the panic, was caused by the actions of just one small machine that appeared at the right place at the right moment. The crew of the BA-64 no longer took unnecessary risks. They had done everything they could, and far more than anyone could have expected. After delivering that final, decisive strike that completely disorganized the Germans, the driver pushed the little machine to its limits. The armored car sped along the roadside and disappeared behind the bend. There was no pursuit. The Germans had no time for that. They were too busy gathering the remnants of their shattered column, extinguishing fires, tending to the wounded, and trying to comprehend what on earth had just happened. The Bobik drove away from the battlefield, leaving behind a picture of total devastation. Imagine the scene at sunset. The road littered with twisted wreckage, a few vehicles still smoldering, crates and canisters scattered everywhere, soldiers' personal items strewn across the ground. German troops, exhausted and enraged, struggled to restore some semblance of order. The two tanks that had chased the BA-64 across the field now returned, their crews bewildered by the chaos. That battle group would go no farther that day. They would take no part in tomorrow's fight. They were out of action, not by artillery, not by bombs from the sky, but by the daring actions of a single light armored car. How long would it take the Germans to clear the wreckage, repair their vehicles, and restore combat readiness? A day? 2? In the context of the upcoming Battle of Kursk, that was an eternity. It's entirely possible that somewhere at some critical sector of the front, the absence of that one unit, those very tanks, made the difference between a breakthrough and a stalemate. Perhaps the local success achieved by these two nameless soldiers contributed a tiny but meaningful part to the greater victory. And what of our heroes? They returned to base. The vehicle was intact, only a few fresh bullet marks and shrapnel scars on the armor. The crew was exhausted, their ears ringing, faces blackened with soot and gunpowder. But they were alive, and they had won. They had achieved the impossible. They returned with a victory that, by all logic, should have made them legends. But history had other plans. And here begins the most mysterious part of the story. The crew arrived at their unit and filed their report. But how exactly did that report sound? Imagine the reaction of the staff officer reading it. A reconnaissance car commander walks in and reports, spotted movement of a large enemy armored column. Coordinates such and such. Engaged. Column halted, partially destroyed. The officer would likely stare at him as if he'd lost his mind. Engaged in a BA-64 against a tank column? Are you insane? Your order was reconnaissance. Their story was probably met with disbelief. In the chaos of war, with headquarters buried under piles of urgent dispatches, no one would take the time to verify such an unbelievable tale. The only thing that mattered was that they brought back valuable intelligence about the enemy column's location. That part would be noted. The information would be passed up the chain, and perhaps soon after, artillery or aircraft would strike those coordinates. But the details, the incredible, almost cinematic details of their stand, might simply vanish. They might be dismissed as exaggeration, a soldier's tall tale. Sure, they ran into the enemy, fired a few bursts, burned a truck or two. Well done. But stopping a whole column? Come on. And then came the fog of war. The written report could easily have been lost during a headquarters relocation. The officer who received it might have been killed days later. The heroes themselves might have been reassigned or, more likely, killed in a later battle before they could tell their story again. In those days, men died by the thousands. Heroic acts were daily occurrences, and many went unnoticed, unrecorded. Commendations were typically written for those whose deeds happened in sight of commanders, on decisive sectors of the front. But a feat performed on some secondary road, deep in enemy territory without witnesses except the participants themselves, had every chance of being forgotten, or at best reduced to a brief note in a unit's war log, if even that. Perhaps the commander, realizing he had violated a direct order, avoided describing all the details in his report. Perhaps he wrote only the essentials. Enemy column discovered and delayed. He wasn't seeking glory. He was doing his duty as he understood it. So why did this story, even if recorded somewhere, never become widely known? Why do the names of these men not stand alongside the famous heroes of the war? To answer that, we must understand the nature of Soviet military and propaganda machinery of the time. It operated by its own logic. Heroes were necessary, examples of courage and sacrifice to inspire soldiers and civilians alike. But they had to be the right kind of heroes. The ideal hero was clear and symbolic. The infantryman throwing himself under a tank with a grenade, the pilot ramming an enemy aircraft, the gunner firing his last shell before death. Simple, visible, and perfect for posters. But a story about a tiny armored car that defeated a whole column through cunning, maneuver, and tactical brilliance. That was too complex. It wasn't about brute force, but about intellect. Not about martyrdom, but about asymmetric thinking, almost guerrilla tactics. Such a story was hard to sell to the masses. Worse, it risked setting a dangerous precedent. If soldiers who disobeyed direct orders, even successfully, were glorified, it could undermine discipline, the sacred foundation of the Red Army. Orders were absolute. Initiative was valued, but only within strict limits. Thus, even if higher command knew the truth of that skirmish, it could easily have been quietly overlooked. The crew might have received decorations, perhaps the Medal for Courage or the Order of the Red Star, with a generic citation, for bravery and valor displayed in combat, without mention of what truly happened, and so the story dissolved. The documents went into archives, stamped secret, where they would lie for decades. The regiment's official history recorded larger, clearer events. The miraculous skirmish faded, living only in the memory of its two participants, who likely never thought of themselves as extraordinary. To them, it was just another hard day of war, one they survived, and in which they did their job. Yet, though the specific feat of that BA-64 crew was forgotten, the machine itself continued to serve faithfully until the war's very end. And with each passing month, commanders and soldiers alike came to appreciate that little workhorse more and more. After the Battle of Kursk, when the Red Army seized the strategic initiative, the role of mobile reconnaissance and strike groups only grew. The BA-64s became the cavalry of a new, motorized war, always at the front, leading the advancing tank and mechanized corps. They were the first to burst into towns and villages, spreading panic behind enemy lines, seizing bridges and crossings, denying the foe time to organize a defense. In urban combat, the Bobik found new purpose. Its small size and agility allowed it to maneuver through narrow streets where tanks couldn't go. It supported infantry assaults with machine gun fire, suppressed enemy positions in windows and attics. Of course, its armor was vulnerable to Panzerfaust's dash, but speed and surprise often saved its crew. The BA-64 rolled across Europe through Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Austria. It fought in the streets of Berlin, its gunfire helping to clear the last pockets of resistance. And after victory in Germany came another war. In the summer of 1945, thousands of these armored cars were shipped east to join the campaign against the Guandong Army in Manchuria. There, in the harsh mountainous deserts of Asia, their reliability and off-road capability proved indispensable once again. They once more marched at the vanguard, scouting ahead and capturing key objectives. But even after the Second World War ended, the story of the Bobik did not. The little armored car remained in service with the Soviet Army for years and was exported to several Allied nations, among them North Korea, where it saw action in yet another major conflict. This small armored car, built in haste during the darkest days of the war, proved to be a surprisingly durable and successful machine. It became a symbol of that war, simple, unpretentious, yet capable of great deeds in skilled and courageous hands. Each of the thousands of BA-64s produced was a silent witness to hundreds, even thousands of small, often forgotten acts of heroism, like the one we've just revisited. The story of our unnamed crew, for all its uniqueness, is not an anomaly in the history of war. The David versus Goliath phenomenon, when the few triumph over the many not by strength, but by skill, is as old as human conflict itself. Remember the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. They didn't win, but they inflicted massive losses and delayed the Persian army by exploiting a narrow pass that nullified its numerical advantage. The same principle: turn the enemy's strength into his weakness. Or take the British destroyers attacking German battleships in World War II. Tiny, agile vessels armed with torpedoes hurled themselves into what seemed suicidal assaults on giants like the Bismarck. Their guns couldn't pierce battleship armor, but a single torpedo in the right spot could cripple the monster. Again, asymmetric warfare using speed and surprise against brute force. In Vietnam, guerrillas armed with simple weapons fought the most technologically advanced army in the world and held their ground. They couldn't win in open battle, so they changed the rules. They used terrain, ambushes, and traps to make the Americans fight on their terms. The BA-64 crew's feat belongs to that same lineage. They didn't play by the Germans' rules. They didn't try to outgun tanks. They imposed their own game, turning an open battlefield, where armor and caliber dominate, into a maze where speed, cunning, and psychological insight decide the outcome. They used the road, the forest, the terrain itself as weapons. They used panic and confusion as their ammunition. This episode is a brilliant reminder that victory in war doesn't always belong to the side with more soldiers or tanks, but to those who think better, who can see the unseen weakness and strike it. It's a timeless lesson that human intellect, courage, and willpower can be stronger than any steel. So what remains of this story today? Searching for the truth is like the work of an archaeologist. Historians and enthusiasts piece together fragments from military archives, reconstructing the past grain by grain. They sift through piles of reports, combat journals, operational summaries, award citations, most handwritten in fading ink on yellowed paper. Usually, they find only dry numbers. As a result of reconnaissance, 1 truck and up to 10 enemy soldiers destroyed. Behind such sparse lines may lie an entire epic, but we'll never know. Sometimes a little more is found. A fleeting mention in a veteran's memoirs, a story of scouts in a light armored car scattering an entire German convoy. No names, no dates, just a rumor, a frontline legend. The greatest discovery a researcher can hope for is a commendation sheet with a detailed description of the deed. Rarely, an officer took the time to write down exactly what a soldier had done to earn his medal. And in those few surviving pages, some of the most incredible forgotten stories can still be uncovered. But to find it, you must know what you're looking for. Without names, unit numbers, or locations, the search becomes a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. There are oral tales, 2 stories passed down among veterans of a single regiment. But as time goes on, veterans fade, memories blur, details are embellished. Truth and legend merge until they're indistinguishable. Even so, the work continues. With digital archives and modern databases, new possibilities emerge. Enthusiasts compare notes online, cross-reference clues, build hypotheses. Maybe one day they'll succeed. Maybe, deep in some dusty archive, there lies that yellowed page, a report, a citation, that will restore to history the names of the 2 brave men who, together, won their small but vital battle. Until then, their names remain unknown, And this story stands as a monument to all nameless soldiers of that great war. In the end, what does this story leave us with? It leaves us with awe and quiet sadness. Awe at the courage and ingenuity of two men who dared to challenge a vastly stronger enemy. They weren't superheroes, they were ordinary men, thrust by war into impossible circumstances. But in the decisive moment, they rose above fear, above orders, above reason itself, and did the impossible. They proved that the spirit of a human being can be stronger than any armor. And sadness, because their names are lost. We remember Matrusov, Costello, Kosmodemianskaya, heroes whose deeds became legend. But how many others performed equally great acts and were forgotten? Hundreds? Thousands? We'll never know. This story is their memorial. A tribute to all the nameless heroes whose courage was swallowed by time and the chaos of war. To those who received no medals, whose names never appeared in newspapers, but who simply did their duty, honestly, quietly, to the very end. True heroism rarely shouts. It often speaks in silence. In a driver's decision to face fire, in a commander's resolve to take responsibility, in their shared, wordless acceptance of mortal risk for the sake of victory. Maybe we don't need their names. Maybe the fact that such people existed and that such things happened is reward enough. This isn't just a story about a battle. It's a parable that even one or two people can change the course of events. That the small and the weak can triumph over the large and the mighty, if they have will, intelligence, and courage. Their monument isn't carved in stone. It's the story itself, passed from one generation to the next. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their story, they live on. Two unknown soldiers, in their small but legendary BA-64 armored car.